Screwed news. In both parties, there's been a sharp contrast drawn between the political establishment candidates like Marco Rubio, John Kasich, and Hillary Clinton, and the populist outsider candidates like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. A lot of differences between the Donald and the Bernie, but there's one big similarity. Both candidates are upsetting the political status quo in their respective parties because neither candidate has a super PAC or any major political donors. The Bernie Sanders for President campaign prides itself as a campaign paid for by the 99%, not the 1%, not the billionaires, and his campaign managed to raise over $40 million in small contributions from individuals just in the month of February alone. And Donald Trump boasted that he would make America start winning again, in part because he claims that he's above the influence of money in politics because he's really rich.
And he'll say, please, please, please. He'll beg for a little while. And I'll say, no interest. Then he'll call all sorts of political people, and I'll say, sorry, fellas, no interest, because I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I don't need anybody's money. I'm using my own money. I'm not using the lobbyists. I'm not using donors. I don't care. I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second.
And it's issues like this that resonate with voters, and why there are a number of independents out there who aren't sure whether they like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump more. The simple fact is people are upset about Washington's revolving door between lobbying firms and the government, and they're tired of the extraordinary amount of undue power that Wall Street and other special interests, the fossil fuel industry in particular, wield in our political system. It's not just Washington Beltway politics that people are upset about, despite what the Republicans all claim. As Bernie Sanders says clearly over and over again in his speeches, people are upset with the whole system of establishment politics and establishment economics because people know that it's a rigged system. And it's a rigged system, rigged in part by economic hitmen who make sure that everyone is in debt so that the rich get richer while the poor and the middle class get poorer. Here now to talk more about this is John Perkins, former chief economist at a major international consulting firm where he advised the World Bank, the United Nations, the IMF, the U.S. Treasury Department, Fortune 500 corporations, as well as governments in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. He's also the author of New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, an updated edition of the 2005 New York Times bestseller Confessions of an Economic Hitman. John, great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you again, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. So what do you mean when you talk about economic hitmen, for people who haven't heard our conversations from way back when?
Well, you know, economic hitmen, I think, when I was playing that game, what we really were doing was exploiting third world countries, economically developing countries, and creating huge amounts of debt for those countries, using that debt to hire our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in those countries. So the money actually never went to the countries, it went to our own companies. And these projects, in addition to making profits for our companies, would help a few wealthy families in that country who own the industries and the commercial establishments, but not the majority of the people. They'd be left holding a huge debt. It would take away from their education funds, their health care, and other social services. And in the end, we'd go back and say, hey, since you can't pay your debts, sell your oil or some other resource real cheap to our corporations, or privatize your electric utilities, your water and sewage systems, all of your publicly owned businesses, sell them to our big corporations. And you know, I think one of the reasons I wrote the New Confessions is in the last 12 years, that's really come home to roost in the United States. So this economic hitman system has spread from the developing countries to the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. And we know now that it's really created a global economic failure, what I call a death economy, an economy that's based on debt, fear, militarization, and the destruction of resources. We've got to change that.
Yeah. I get when you were talking about we'll take a bunch of money and it seemed like you were almost describing the whole plan for Iraq and Afghanistan, except that those countries didn't go into debt. We went into debt to do that, but it was still basically, let's make Halliburton rich, let's, that kind of thing. But you said it's coming home. Can you give me some examples? Can you make this real?
Well, yeah, and to go back to what you said, I think it's very fascinating because when the economic hitmen failed, and I talk in my books about how I failed with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and of Panama, Omar Torrijos, then jackals go in and either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. Both of those two men, my clients, were assassinated because they didn't accept the deals from me. When the jackals also fail, like in Iraq and Libya and Syria, then the military goes in. It kind of accomplishes the same thing and takes out the leader and takes over the resources and privatizes everything and makes lots of money for the big corporations.
So basically, a country that has less power than the United States, or has less economic power than a group of transnational corporations who are employing somebody like you, they can either listen to a nice fellow like you and say, okay, fine, we'll go in debt and we'll give you our resources and please don't pick on us. Or the leaders are facing literally assassination. You said 2 of the people that you had these conversations with who turned you down were later killed. I'm guessing you didn't authorize those killings, but
No.
you know. And if that doesn't work, whether they're dead or not, if the country doesn't then go into debt to the United States or to these transnational corporations, in comes the U.S. military. Is this a model that other countries are doing? I mean, in a way, it almost sounds like what the British were doing in the late 1700s when they forbade the manufacture of fine clothing in the United States and weaponry in the United States. Everything had to be imported. And that was part of the basis for the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, a lot of historians will tell you that the Revolutionary War really wasn't about freedom from England. It was about merchants here, wealthy people like Jefferson and Revere and Washington, who didn't like the trade agreements that were unfair, they thought, to Americans. Yeah, so we have something similar going on here now. It's a game as old as empire. It's this empire building game, and now it has come home to roost. And we're seeing in this country today this tremendous amount of debt, where we've got mounting debt from education, from credit cards, from home mortgages, people being put into deep debt. We've seen, since the end of the recession in 2009, 95% of the wealth that's been created since then has gone to 1% of our population, while 90% of us in the United States have gotten poorer since 2009. I mean, that's a devastating fact.
Yeah.
We also see that less than 5% of us live in the United States, and yet we consume almost 30% of the world's resources. Well, half the world's starving or on the verge of starvation. That's not a model. So the system that we've created globally, why I say it's a global failure, is because it isn't a model. China, with 19% of the world's population, can't possibly emulate what we've done. They want to, they're trying, they can't. Brazil can't, India can't. It's not a model. So we have to recognize it's a failed system, and we're going to continually have crashes in the economy. And we can talk about, the short-term economics, the cycles that we go through, but in the long run, we're headed for calamity unless we move into a fairer economy, a life economy, an economy that's based on cleaning up pollution, on regenerating destroyed resources and alleviating the causes of terrorism, those kinds of things.
This has been going on for a long time. We had Bobby Kennedy in the program last week talking about the history of Syria. And after World War II, the Syrians were so excited about emulating the United States and modeling their constitution on ours, and they democratically elected a democratically elected president. The CIA went in, overthrew him. They put in a dictator. We put in a dictator. 6 or 8 years later, the CIA went in and overthrew him, yeah. And that set the stage for both their turning to Russia, to the Soviet Union at the time, and also the Bashir government. This is an old song, isn't it?
Very, and if you go back to where we really in the United States got into it, it was with Mossadegh, who was an elected prime minister of Iran back in the early 50s, and democratically elected president, incredibly good policies. We didn't like the way he was treating oil companies. Overthrew him. I've so often thought, Tom, what if we'd supported that? What if we'd said, yeah, he's right. Let the Iranians get a fair share of the profits from their own oil. Right. That could have affected the whole Middle East. We might not have all the messes that we have today. But there's
this, prevailing notion in the United States that God just made a mistake putting our oil into their sand. I mean, it's
yes, and also all of these wars make a lot of money and give a lot of power to a few rich, powerful people. So I think that's to a large degree what these wars are about.
Back before Reaganism, before the destruction of American manufacturing, all these crazy trade deals and whatnot, banking was 5 or 6% of our economy. It was basically the lubricant for the economy, and banking was a boring business, and bankers worked 10 to 4, and they didn't get rich. Some of them were upper middle class and petty wealthy, but it was not what it is today. Now banking is 14% of our economy, I think 13 or 14. It's massive and it's huge. When did banksters become hitmen Or is that an inaccurate characterization?
That's a totally accurate characterization, and I talk extensively about that in the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. My great uncle was the president of a small bank in Waterbury, Vermont, and he took great pride in the way that he treated the community, and he saw himself as a partner. You know, he didn't want to foreclose on anybody. It was his fault. He thought if he had to foreclose. Right. But that all changed. It's taken a bit of time to do it, but I think a real turning point was 9/11. And I talk in the book about interviews I've had with big bankers since then who said, in a way, 9/11 taught them that, you know, life's short, and let's take advantage of everything we possibly can. And let's get as rich as we possibly can. Let's take advantage of this system. It's that shock doctrine idea.
It put the greed is good of the Reagan era on steroids?
Certainly did.
You know, functionally.
It certainly did.
How is this going to play out here at home? Where do you see this going?
Well, I think, and I do a lot of public speaking. I'm speaking tomorrow night at the World Affairs Club here in Washington, and the next night at Busboys and Poets, and I speak at all different kinds of realms, and including to CEOs of corporations. And I see the heads of these big corporations understanding that we need to change. And let's face it, it's the big corporations that control the world today. They are calling the shots. They pretty much run government. And despite what both Sanders and Trump say, that they're not taking money from the moneyed people, everybody around them is. And whoever gets to be the next president is going to be surrounded by people who are very, very beholden to big corporations. But the big corporations are just corporations. And we, the people, really control them. They are dependent on us to buy their goods and services, to invest in them, to use our tax dollars and government policies to support them. We need to convince them that they've got to move into what I call a life economy, which is an economy that cleans up pollution and regenerates destroyed parts of the earth. We need to see that we've got to change our mindset, our outlook on this economic system. We don't need to continue along the route that we've been going for the last several decades. We need to move into a new experience in the economy, a global economy, a truly global economy that understands that it's about life, it's about creating a better planet for all of us, not just for a few wealthy people. Right. It's about taking care of future generations.
Yeah. Boy, I wish all of our politicians were talking that way. John Perkins, always great to see you, my friend.
Likewise, Tom. Thanks so much. Thanks for all your good work.